Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Berechot, chapter 2, Halacha 6. Today we're getting into the next logical conclusion. We were just talking about Tameh and Tahor with the concentration regarding the mayim of the Para Aduma, the water from the Para Aduma water, which is the highest of the high for purification. And this is in context for somebody who's working in the Bet HaMikdash to set up the purification waters. Now, what's the first mitzvah in the Torah? The first mitzvah in the Torah is poravu, which is to get married and to have children. Now, the logical thing is, what happens when this guy who's setting up this thing for purity has to, come and say the Shema. And so that is what is taking place in Halacha 5. Now we're getting into when a guy who is doing what he is supposed to do, Jews are supposed to get married and have children. So tonight is the wedding night, and the Shema comes about, and he has to say the Shema. And the way that you're supposed to be, the Torah writes that there's not supposed to be a promiscuous man or woman in Am Yisrael. It is evil and wicked not, to be and to treat yourself like a zonah. And in fact, if you look carefully at the laws of a zonah, once somebody has the status of a zonah, the halachic status of a zonah, they can't undo it. They can't fix it. In other words, it's not undoable. And you can prove it because once a zonah is a zonah, has the status of a zonah, no matter how much tshuva they do, no matter how many times they go to the mikvah, they can never marry the Kohen Gadol. It is not fixable. So one of the most important things is to get married. And one of the most important things is to make sure your daughters get married and they don't delay in getting married, because you don't want to have a situation come up where they're off risking themselves and going and meeting charming men and getting seduced. And, why does that matter? Because you're creating a lot of spiritual damage in the woman. And the Zohar talks about how there's a connection between the woman. There's also a sugya in the Gemara that the mind of the woman is always connected to the first man that she's with. And the proper and the right context is always where a man is there on his first time with his wife, who's also there on the first time, and they're getting married at a younger age. So the Hasidim often will do it at 18, 19, and the Litvish will often do it at 21, 22. But whatever you do, it's very important if you have children to make sure that they get married at a young age. And there's a lot of spiritual reasons why you don't want them going off into these perverted behaviors, because once they start to go into those things with tumah, they can never quite get the tumah out of their system, and you end up damaging them. I'll tell you, there's a real phenomenon that if you touch the wings of a butterfly, the butterfly has dust on the wings. The butterfly naturally grows dust on the wings. And if you touch with your fingers the dust on this butterfly's wings, the butterfly can never fly again. It will just sit there on the ground until a bird eats it or it gets stepped on. But the butterfly can never fly again. And it's the same too, where once your daughter or something goes off to these things of perversion, or same with a man, that you can't quite fix it. It's unfixable. It's not just a physical fixing, it's a spiritual and emotional and mental fixing. So always the right context is what the Torah says. And that's why it's so important if you're raising children to go and to be Haredi and to get into the Haredi system and to blend yourself into the system so that you can have children who will get into healthy relationships with people from other families that also have healthy relationships. Mishnah starts off and says a groom is exempt from the Shema recital from the first night of his marriage until Saturday night, and if he did not yet perform the act of cohabitation. So this again is talking about whether you're going to be able to be at that wedding night and dispatch the obligation or not. Now, nowadays, this exemption does not apply in practice, but this is again, something in the Mishnah. This was in practice at the time, and it's a theological point about being able to level the right kind of concentration for the Shema. Now, the Gemara relates that there was an incident regarding Rabban Gamliel, who married a woman and recited the Shema on the first night of his marriage. And his students said to him, "Our teacher, you've taught us that a groom is exempt from reciting the Shema at this time. Why are you reciting it?" And he said to them, "I will not listen to you to remove the acceptance of the sovereignty of heaven from myself, even for one moment." So I want to point out what the Rambam says about this, the idea that the Rambam is saying. The Rambam is saying that Rabban Gamliel maintains that although a groom is exempt from the obligation of reciting the Shema, he is nevertheless permitted to recite it if he chooses to, provided that he rids his mind of the distraction and concentrates properly on the Shema. That's the idea that the Rambam has in his commentary on Hilchos Kriyas Shema in chapter 4, Halacha 7. In other words, in this case, Rabban Gamliel chose to recite the Shema when he was a groom, and the reason why was because he had this real desire to always be in a continuous state of trying to accept upon himself the yoke of heavenly sovereignty. And even though he wasn't legally required to do it, he wanted to do it. So that's a thing for us to really appreciate. This is a model for us to appreciate, that we always want to be, even if you have a pass, you always want to be doing something where you're always reaching toward accepting the sovereignty of heaven. And that's a really key idea for why this is also stated in the Mishnah. It's not just stated as a halacha where it says, okay, you're exempt, that's it, let's move on to the Gemara. No, they bring along in this Mishnah that even though he is exempt, he's seeking to continuously accept upon himself the yoke of heavenly sovereignty. And that is a beautiful idea. Now, the Mishnah was talking about a groom that is exempt from reciting the Shema on the wedding night and through Saturday night, which implies that on the Shabbos he is exempt. Now, the Gemara is going to get into this topic. Gemara is going to wonder what happens if you've married a woman who's never been with a man and it's the Shabbos. So the Gemara says that Rabbi Elazar ben Antigonus said in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Yanai. This Mishnah informs us that it is permitted to cohabit with a virgin for the first time on the Shabbos. So I want to point out something about this. So normally a groom is going to be exempt from the Shema recital because he cannot concentrate properly. Okay, he's going to be distracted with, the first act of cohabitation. He's not going to be able to have his mind on the mitzvah, okay, and the mitzvah of the Shema. And the question is now, would it be forbidden for him to perform that act on the Shabbos? Because, even if, he's not distracted, the question is going to be about other things. whether he's going to be, she's going to be permitted to him on the Shabbos. And the Mishnah seems to be indicating that he is exempt even on the Shabbos, and that he's permitted to cohabit with her on the Shabbos. So there's another Amora who deflects this inference, the one by Rabbi Elazar ben Antigonus. Rabbi Chagai said before Rabbi Yosa, interpret the Mishnah as referring to a groom who marries a widow, where the act of cohabitation does not make a wound. So, in other words, the idea is look, he's not actually making an opening because there's no tearing of any of the hymen. And so basically what Rabbi Chagai is saying is he's saying that, look, the reason that it's permitted on the Shabbos is because the Mishnah is referring to a widow. That's the idea of Rabbi Chagai. And so that he's saying that, in this case, the groom is preoccupied and he's exempt from reciting the Shema even on the Shabbos. But for a groom who marries a virgin, perhaps he is not going to be exempt from the recitation of the Shema on the Shabbos because it is in fact forbidden to cohabit with a virgin on the Shabbos. That's really going to be the question and the inference. The Pnei Moshe says like this. He says that even if this interpretation holds that even if someone married a widow, he's going to be preoccupied, even though he won't rupture her hymen, but he's apprehensive that something might prevent him from cohabiting with his bride on time or at this time. In other words, perhaps she'll become temeh or something. So there's another way to look at it, says the Haredim. The Haredim says that according to this interpretation by Rabbi Chagai, regardless as to whether the groom marries a virgin or a widow, he has a period of exemption from the Shema recital. And in the case of a widow, the period of exemption includes the Shabbos. But in the case of a virgin, it does not include the Shabbos, since cohabitation with her is forbidden on that day. So Rabbi Yosa is going to reject this suggestion from Rabbi Chagai. And again, I want to point out that the Pnei Moshe and the Haredim are not giving their opinion. What they're doing is they're trying to explain what exactly is the position of Rabbi Chagai, what exactly is he trying to say, and the details and implications for that. Again, this is not necessarily what the halacha is, and if you want to know the halacha, always go to the Shulchan Aruch. Rabbi Yosa rejects this suggestion. He said to Rabbi Chagai, but we learned in a brisa that a groom is exempt from the Shema recital for 4 nights from his wedding night until Saturday night. So the Gemara continues, says, can you possibly say regarding the case of a widow that there are 4 nights from the wedding until Saturday night? And basically saying, certainly not, because a widow's wedding is going to always take place on a Thursday. And by the way, the wedding with a virgin is going to take place on a Wednesday. So that with Wednesday, you're going to have 4 nights from the wedding until Saturday night. And regarding that case, the Mishnah is indicating that the groom is going to be exempt from the Shema recital through Saturday night, including the Shabbos. So it follows that one is indeed permitted to cohabit with a virgin for the first time on the Shabbos. So I want to point out how the Haredim explains this. He's saying that according to Rabbi Yosa's explanation of the Mishnah, a groom who marries a widow has no exemption from reciting the Shema, even on the night of the wedding. For the Mishnah and the Brisa refer only to a groom who marries a virgin, and there is no Tanaic source which specifies that one who marries a widow is also exempt. So we revert to our initial understanding that the Mishnah exempts a groom only on account of the unique mental distraction caused by the prospect of cohabiting with a virgin, and not on account of the lesser distraction associated with cohabiting with a bride who is not a virgin. So that's going to be a deeper point and about this. So whether this is going to be a distraction or not. So about the validity of Rabbi Elazar ben Antigonus's inference from this Mishnah that cohabiting with a virgin is going to be permitted on the Sabbath, the Gemara is going to question why he needed to infer this law from the Mishnah. And Rabbi Yaakov bar Zavdi said, I asked the following question for Rabbi Yosa. This would be Rabbi Yosa the Amara. And basically what they're saying here is that it should be obvious that cohabiting with a virgin is permitted on the Sabbath, and granted that the groom does rupture the hymen in the process. And the Gemara is going to want to understand about, this this case. So Gemara says that what difference is there between this and that which we learned in the Mishnah, that a person may break a cask in order to eat dried figs from it? Just as it is permitted to break the cask, so too it should be permitted to rupture the hymen. So, in other words, why would it be necessary to deduce this law from an inference from this Mishnah? In other words, what he's saying is that you're allowed to go break a cask of figs, and it doesn't qualify as a malacha. And since the breaking is going to be a destructive act, it is going to be permitted. Now, as a general rule, a destructive act does not qualify as an actual performance of a malacha on the biblical level, but it is going to be prohibited under rabbinical law. So the Ron, in the commentary to the Rif in Shabbos, in folio 61b, says that in this instance, the rabbis permitted outright, and again, permitted outright the act of breaking the cask so as to allow the proper enjoyment of the Sabbath. And since the breakage is necessary in order to be eligible to eat the dried figs, they allowed that you can go and do that. So that basically what they're saying is that they're saying that Rabbi Yaakov bar Zavdi is basically arguing that, based on this ruling, that a groom should be permitted to be with his, wife and to rupture the hymen in the first act of cohabitation, and that he's basically assuming that this wounding is considered a destructive act because it destroys the commodity of virginity. And we always know that when you get married, that the virgin is worth 200 zuz, and that the widow is going to be worth 100 zuz. So that's effectively the logic. In other words, the reasoning of Rabbi Yaakov is like this. He's basically saying that just like the rabbis permitted the destructive act of breaking the cask in order to enjoy the Shabbos, so too it must be that during this other act by the husband and wife, that this too is going to be facilitating the enjoyment of Shabbos, and that's basically going to be the argument. Now, there's many Rishonim who are going to dispute the Ron's explanation about the permit to break the cask, and that being based on the rule that a destructive act is going to be permitted when they are necessary for the enjoyment of the Shabbos. Now, it's very important. The laws of Shabbos are very important, and you gotta really go back to Shulchan Aruch and go through all the details. Again, we're going over the logic of the Gemara. This is not necessarily the halacha l'maisa, and we're trying to go through these points so that we can walk in the footsteps of our fathers who are, Rishonim, and they were sitting there struggling to try to come up with what the halacha is, and they were reading these same texts, and they were looking at what the other Rishonim were saying as well. And that's what we're doing as well. Please do not read this stuff as being halacha l'maisa. So the Gemara now is going to give another question as to the necessity of this inference. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Rav Mehar Shia asked, what difference is there between this act of rupturing the hymen and the case recorded in the Mishnah of one who lances a boil on the Sabbath, which is permitted? In other words, the Mishnah is teaching. There's another Mishnah in Masechet Shabbos that's teaching that it's permitted to pop a boil, basically, and that does cause a wound when you do it. Now, I remember in that Mishnah that if you're popping the boil just to pop it, you can't do it. But if you're popping the boil to get the pus out, then you can do it because the pus is irritating and it causes a lot of discomfort. And so the destructive act of cutting the skin, the idea is that you're doing one thing on that side, and the other thing on this other side is to get the pus out. And that getting the pus out from having caused a wound, again, you're not allowed to cause a wound on Shabbos, but the getting the pus out is again for the enjoyment of Shabbos because it causes this terrible irritation and suffering. Boils are really terrible, and in fact, boils were one of the plagues that that Hashem sent to the Egyptians. So these can be very, very painful, and we want to enjoy our Shabbos. So again, we're not talking about popping pimples and boils just to pop them. We're talking about doing it where it's in a case where it's very, very painful, and the idea is not to pop it. The idea is to get the pus out of it. Okay, so the question is going to be that, just like over here where you're permitted to lance a boil in this case, so too you should be permitted to rupture the hymen. That's really going to be the inference here. So that Rav Yitzhak is basically maintaining that one who is with his virgin wife, he is creating an opening not for its defined purpose, and the groom's interest is to release the bride's hymenal blood in order to be certain that she's a virgin. And the reason why is because if she isn't, she can get, or he can have the Bet Din either nullify the marriage for fraud. Sometimes people will say that they are and they're not, and she has a guarantee of 200 zuz, and really it's only worth 100 zuz. So that's basically why it's done on Wednesday, because if you get married to a virgin bride on Wednesday, you can go to the Bet Din on Thursday. If she's not, you can bring the sheet, you can bring the evidence, and you can contest it. So these things always need to be done with a Bet Din, and that's why they're being given the time to do it, and that's why it's not important for a widow. That's why a widow is allowed to marry on a Thursday, because anyway, that she's not a virgin, and there's no fraud there. And so you don't need to take her to the Bet Din if there's a case of fraud and trickery and things like that. So part of the idea here is that part of Rav Yitzhak's point is that the idea and his thinking is to do it in order to confirm that she is, and so that the intention isn't just like popping the boil, where the intention is to get out the pus. Okay, over here the intention is not to make a wound or to make a lasting wound or to make a lasting opening. Really, what it is to confirm virginity. That's the point of Rav Yitzhak, and I want to point out that why according to explanation by the Tosfot about this, that, by the way, you can see a parallel about this in Tosfot and Ketubot 6b, and that the Tosfot is saying that in the case of the lancing of the boil to remove the fluid, the rabbis relaxed their general restriction against creating an opening, not for a defined purpose, and in the interest of allowing the person to alleviate the pain, and my own words here is to taking out the pus. And basically, it follows, says the Tosfot, that in the case of being with a virgin, they should similarly have relaxed that restriction in the interest of enabling the groom to perform the mitzvah of being with his wife, and that is a mitzvah. So the performance of a mitzvah is no less important than the alleviation of pain, says the Tosfot in Ketubot 6b. You can see more commentary about that from the Rosh. Anyway, so Rabbi Yossi is going to respond, and he said to Rabbi Yitzchak, and says that, say the Mishnah segment that follows the phrase you just quoted, for the Mishnah there teaches that the permit to lance a boil is only provided that one does not intend to create a lasting opening in the boil. And the Gemara says that now here, since presumably the groom intends to make her a non-virgin, one could argue that it is as if he did intend to make a lasting opening in her. In other words, he's saying that on the basis of the Mishnah alone, we might have thought that it is forbidden to be with a virgin on the Shabbos. In other words, Rabbi Elazar ben Antigonus therefore needed to infer this permit in the Mishnah, and that it's actually a necessary thing. And we're going to get into this permit now, but really, they're all saying that Rabbi Elazar ben Antigonus's inference and reading into this Mishnah and reading that Rebbe is basically implying this law here is a necessary thing in order to know what the halacha is in the case of doing all this on Shabbos. By the way, if it would be where you'd be too distracted, okay, you could have a period of time where you got married on a Wednesday, and over there on Saturday, and if you're doing something where it could be leading up to that act, say like Friday night, there could be that waiver extended to not extended over 3 days, but instead of things happening on the first night, it's happening a few nights later, then that basically moves the time on when you would have this waiver on saying the Shema for the consecration. Now again, point out that you always want to accept the yoke of heavenly sovereignty, and so I also want to point out that this law does not apply today. But the point is that it does matter on all of this, because it's always going to be better to say the Shema on the Shabbos, and the question is about also moving the timeline on this permit. So it's not just talking about what happens on Shabbos and whether you can do this on Shabbos. Also in the background is talking about moving this deadline on this leniency for concentration, because you're distracted by this act, on over to another day. And so that's also an undertone in this Mishnah. So the Gemara now is going to demonstrate that, in fact, a disagreement among the Tanaim regarding this issue occurs. So Gemara says that it was taught in a Baraisa, a person should not cohabit with a bride for the first time on the Shabbos because he makes a wound, but others allow it. Now, the Gemara is going to get into the reason for the permitted opinion, okay, for why it would be. And the Gemara reads that Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Avin, said, the reason of the others is that when cohabiting, the groom intends merely to go about his activity of cohabiting with his bride, and the wound to her hymen occurs automatically during the act. And since he does not intend to afflict the wound, he is permitted to perform that act. So I want to point out what the Rosh Cirilio says about this. He's saying that the groom performs the act of cohabitation uh, for his pleasure, and because he's married to this woman, he's not doing it out of the context of marriage, and he is intending neither to release the blood, the hymenal blood, or to create an opening. He's actually, basically, says the Rosh Cirilio, is doing it for his enjoyment. And so that's going to be a different reason for why that is. Now, Mara Fulda, he's saying that, and he's understanding that the Gemara at this point is explaining that the others permit cohabitation due to the principle of an unintended act. And you can see more about that in the Bavli and Ketubot 6b, which we were just talking about with the Tosfot. But the principle applies whether a person performs a permitted act, and as a result, a second forbidden act also takes place, which the person did not intend to occur. In this type of situation, one is not required to refrain from the permissible act, even though he knows that the forbidden act may result, provided he did not intend for it. So that's always going to be a key idea about Shabbos, about what your primary intention is, and then what resultant things could come about from that. Always study the laws of Shabbos carefully, and always try to study them on Shabbos with your wife. And it's always good to at least learn a couple of halachot about Shabbos with your wife in the Shulchan Aruch. Anyway, there's another Amoraic ruling regarding the matter, and just Asi said. It doesn't say Rabbi Asi, it's just Asi, and we are referring to the Amara, who's known as Rav Asi, says the Haredim. But the text that we have here in this Gemara just reads Asi, and they just probably wrote it down as shorthand. Sometimes they were under persecution from the Romans at the time, and maybe they were in a rush or something, or maybe it's just something with the scribe. But nonetheless, we're talking about the Amar Rav Asi. Asi said it is forbidden to cohabit with a virgin on the Shabbos, and the Gemara relates an incident that happened when this ruling was issued. So I want to point out something, that when you have a person who's mentioned and it doesn't have where it says like rabbi, or it doesn't say Rav, when it's talking about rabbi, that's going to be one of the rabbis in Eretz Yisrael. And when it's talking about Rav, it's going to be talking about one of the rabbis in Bavel. But this is talking about somebody named Binyamin of Ginzach. And Binyamin of Ginzach doesn't have any title. He's not a learned person, or maybe he learned a little bit, but he's not a rabbi. He's not a sage. He's not somebody who has that title. And this is in here as a really instructive theology lesson for us. And this is one of the most important stories in Berechot, especially for new Baal Tshuvas. Binyamin of Ginzach, again, the Gemara does not give him a title. So that's a big clue here. When he heard this restrictive ruling, he went forth and said in the name of Rav that it is permitted to cohabit with a virgin on the Shabbos. So he's giving a different ruling here, and not just a different ruling, but he's saying it in the name of Rav. And this is very serious. I'm going to read this again because it's so serious. Binyamin of Ginzach, when he heard this restrictive ruling, went forth and said in the name of Rav that it is permitted to cohabit with a virgin on the Shabbos. And Shmuel heard and harbored a grievance against him because, in fact, Rav had not said this. And it's very serious. It's very, very serious. The Haredim is adding that Rav actually ruled that it was forbidden. And I want to point out here that Rav and Shmuel often argue. They often are at odds on halacha. And Shmuel here was upset because Shmuel knew Rav's opinion. Shmuel knew that Rav did not say that. In fact, said the opposite. And this Binyamin guy is coming along and misleading the people. And Rav had, in fact, not said what Binyamin had said. The Gemara says Binyamin had died. And Shmuel proclaimed regarding Binyamin of Ginzach, blessed is he who smote him. And regarding Rav, he recited the verse, there will not befall a righteous man any evil. So here's what happened, right? This guy is coming along, and he gave a false ruling. Haredim says that Hashem smote Binyamin as punishment for his sin of using Rav's authority to justify a leniency that Rav had never permitted. And he therefore nullified Binyamin's false ruling. Now, it's amazing because in Proverbs 12:21, it does say that there will not befall a righteous man any evil. And basically what happened here, says the Haredim, is that heaven protected Rav in that Binyamin was not given an opportunity to spread his incorrect report of Rav's opinion and not to misalign and misrepresent and change the oral law. And how serious is it when you have these rabbis who come along and try to distort the oral law and the teachings? It's very serious. You're really creating a lot of damage for yourself when you do it. And these fake rabbis who are misleading the people are really not doing any service to themselves, and it's really, really terrible what they do. So the Gemara is talking about another topic about whether being with a bride is going to make her tamei or not. We're moving on to a new topic. And Shmuel said that that entire mission at the beginning of the last chapter of Nida is correct as abstract halacha, but not to be followed in practice. So basically what's happening is that in practice, as soon as the first act happened, the bride is going to be forbidden to her husband, regardless of the age and whether she had her period or not. So that we're talking about what's going to be with this kind of blood. And over there, one of the ideas is that even if the woman has the blood from the hymen, there's a lot of evidence in cases and Gemaras that point to that the woman can be in such a shock that it can also trigger some blood from the uterus as well from that initial shock, so that you can't just rely on it only being the blood from the hymen. That it's talking about an abstract that says the blood of the hymen, but in reality and in practice, the initial shocks can actually trigger some blood from the uterus, and that's why she has to go back to the mikveh. And if it did trigger the blood from the uterus, she has to go count clean days again, and she has to go recount everything, so that it's going to be one of those things that you have to keep track of. So Rabbi Yanai fled from ruling leniently, even in the case of a younger girl who was married when her time of discharge for menstrual blood had not yet arrived. So we're talking about here a different generation. We're talking about a time when the average life expectancy was 34 years old. 2,500 years ago, the average life expectancy was about 34 years old. So in every civilization in the world, everyone women and men would get married at, say, 12 and a half to 13, because if you get married at 13 and your life expectancy is 34, it doesn't really give you that much time. So, now when life expectancy is in some countries 84 years old, this looks a bit strange. But again, you have to look at this in context. Now, sometimes a woman would get married at 13, and again, in a time when her life expectancy is 34. Not 34 because of necessarily childbirth. That did happen, but there's no antibiotics, and there's food scarcity issues, and there's water scarcity issues, and there's a lot of things that can kill people. You had malaria, you had all sorts of diseases that ran rampant. I think you had a lot more warfare back then, and you had a lot more lawlessness as well in a lot of areas, so that people, when they made a robbery, the violence was, much higher, and people had a much lower value for the value of life, especially people are not living very long, and then it's compounded because people say, well, life is not that valuable anyway, which we know is not true from the Torah. So this is talking about a different age, and I want to point out another thing about Judaism. So let's say this girl who's, all the people have a life expectancy of something like 34 back then. Okay, this is talking about, a girl, maybe she's getting married at 13, as everybody in every civilization did, wherever you were from 2,500 years ago or 2,000 years ago. This was the norm. And by the way, you didn't even start to see an increase in life expectancies really until about the 1500s. So it's really a very long time of living in this shadow of short life expectancy. Anyway, sometimes a girl would get married at 13 and she wouldn't get her period until 14. That can happen. So that's the kind of case that we're talking about here, okay? Now, the question is going to be in that context. Now, in today's day, okay, Judaism has always had, okay, in the oral law, that you have to follow, the law of the country that you're in, and that the rabbis always have the ability to add new fences and things like that. And so in a day where life expectancy is longer, okay, we do not get married at, these stranger younger ages. The Gemara recommends that, for men to get married at 18. And I also want to point out that there are some people that will take the opinion that some of the matriarchs got married at unusually short ages, like Rivka. And the Vilna Goan points out, and he does the math, that she was actually 16 at the time of the wedding. Some people will try to distort it and say that she was 3 years old. Some people will try to use that as a blood libel against Judaism, that, we're all pedophiles or something like that. It's just another blood libel to try to denigrate Jews and Judaism, and that there is no rabbi today or in any time when there's a long life expectancy that will allow or encourage younger marriages like this. This is only a thing that's happening in a time like when everyone else is also getting married at 13, because the life expectancy is 34 years old, and that we always have to follow the sages, and we always have to follow the law. If you are in a place outside of Israel, you have to follow the law of the country of their land. And in every country in the land, the law for marriage is something like 18. So we're talking about this is a mature topic, and we're talking about a different time. And Judaism does not recommend, Judaism does not endorse, any sort of sexual perversion. Just read the Torah. Torah talks against it. So all the people that try to look at these passages and try to distort the Gemaras and try to make it like Judaism is secretly the most immoral system in the world because it permits pedophilia, that you're all just a bunch of anti-Semites, and it's no different than saying that, Jews make their matzah out of blood. So the Gemara cites this inquiry by certain scholars who assume that the rulings of the Mishnah and Nida still do apply in practice. And one of the Mishnah's rules is that if the bride has reached the age of menstruation, but she never actually did yet, she is permitted to her new husband for 4 nights, even though she bleeds. So again, we're going to get into this rule. This is inquired before Rabbi Yochanan. What is the law regarding cohabitation the second time with the virgin bride? When there's reason to suspect that the initial wound has healed. In other words, is the Mishnah permitting 4 nights of cohabitation even in this situation? Now, this again is going to be a question about the blood from the uterus versus the blood from the hymen, and if the woman can feel that there was any blood from the uterus, she can't wait 4 days. She actually has to go count 7 clean days. Again, this is only a permit only for the hymenal blood. And again, in the first time, there's a lot of sugyas that point to the fact that she can get a shock and it can trigger the uterus to bleed. So that again, the uterine blood is always going to be you have to count 7 days, and then 7 clean days, and then and then only then can you go to the mikvah. So the Gemara is going to continue about Rabbi Yochanan's rejecting this inquiry, and the Gemara says that they said that even when the hymenal wound definitely has not healed, our master Rabbi Yochanan does not rule in actual practice that we attribute her bleeding to blood coming from the hymenal wound, as the Mishnah states. Rather, he rules that after the first act of cohabitation, she is forbidden to her husband. Gemara continues and says, do you think that he would rule that it is permitted to cohabit for a second time when there is no reason to suspect that the hymenal wound has healed? Surely, basically, there's the saying that Rabbi Yochanan would forbid cohabitation in that case. Now, the Haredim says that although you can certainly inquire as to the meaning of the Mishnah, the inquiry has no practical relevance, for in practice Rabbi Yochanan surely holds that the act you inquired about is forbidden. So again, we're asking about if there's a case where a hymenal the rupture of the hymen never healed in less than 4 nights, so that the question is going to be that would a younger bride be permitted for 4 nights, even if there's suspicion of healing, and indefinitely when there's no basis for a suspicion? So Braden points out that although in their inquiry the scholars mention specifically the second act of cohabitation, it applies equally to all acts of cohabitation within the 4 nights mentioned in the Mishnah. So again, you always want to check the Shulchan Aruch about this and get all the details. And when you get married, you always want to study the laws of Nida so that you can do everything in the correct way and follow all the laws of family purity in your house. And if you're lucky enough to get married, if you have the merit to get married to a woman who's never been with somebody, then you have to study all these halachas, and you need to get a rabbi who can teach you these, so that you can know about them, and always have a posek on hand that you can consult with, because you always want to consult with somebody who specializes in this stuff. Anyway, the Gemara is going to try to clarify what's going on here. And the Gemara says, what specific case did this group of scholars inquire about? In other words, try to ask, what are the circumstances of suspicion that this hymenal wound has in fact healed? and concerning which they inquired whether a second act would be permitted. So the Gemara answers and says that they inquired about a case in which the bride experienced days of an interruption of her bleeding and purity from any discharge of blood between the first and second act of cohabitation. In other words, what they're saying is that says the Haredim, saying that the hymenal wound does not necessarily bleed continually, and the bleeding may stop for a while, then resume again. And the stoppage of the bleeding does, however, create a suspicion that the wound is healed. And if it actually did heal, then the subsequent flow must be menstrual blood, which would render her a nida. And Rabbi Yochanan's students are going to be inquiring about the assumption that the Mishnah's rulings still apply in practice, whether the stopping of bleeding within the 4-night period of permissibility after the wedding cancels the permit. And basically, what they're asking and what they're saying, says the Haredim, is that, in the case under discussion, the bleeding was not continuous and it was induced by pressure. And nevertheless, since it stopped completely for some days, there is reason to suspect that the new flow is not going to be the blood from the hymen, but is actually going to be the blood from the uterus. So that would basically make her a nida and make her forbidden, and she has to go count the days, so that she has to go to the mikveh and at a much later date. The Gemara relates an incident that pertains to this previous discussion. Rabbi Abahu said, I was a groomsman of Rabbi Shimon bar Abba, and I asked Rabbi Elazar on his behalf, what is the law regarding cohabiting for the second time on the Shabbos? So now we're getting into a case where the groomsman now is having his second time on the Shabbos. So what's going to be the law? And Rabbi Elazar, says the Gemara, permitted him to do so because he held in accordance with the following statement of Shmuel. For Shmuel said, one may enter a tight breach on the Shabbos, even if this dislodges some pebbles. So again, this is going to be a case where Shmuel is going to be saying that it's an unintended act, and that if you dislodge some pebbles, your idea wasn't to dislodge the pebbles, it was to move into this tight breach. That's why you were going, and the dislodging of pebbles isn't the point, okay? So ordinarily, if you go over there and you go with the intention to dislodge pebbles on Shabbos, you got a big problem. But if you're going because your intention is to go into a tight breach, which you're allowed to do, and some pebbles got dislodged, there's no problem. And that's basically Shmuel's point. Gemara is going to relate a second incident of this nature. Rabbi Chagai said, I was a groomsman of Rabbi Shmuel of Cappadocia, and I asked Rabbi Yoshia on his behalf, because again, he was probably too modest to ask, and he wanted to have somebody else do it because he's baffled, he's bashful, and that's a good quality to have. It's good to be humble, and he asked Rabbi Hoshaya on his behalf whether one may cohabit for a second time with one's bride within the times mentioned in the Mishnah in Nida, and the Gemara says he avoided permitting it. And then the Gemara says that I then asked Rabbi Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak, and he said to me, now that the rabbis have decreed that the rulings of the Mishnah are not to be followed in practice, what is the difference between menstrual blood and hymenal blood? This is the question the Gemara is going to answer. In other words, what this is saying that, even though the woman discharged only blood from the hymen, she is permitted to her husband after the first act of cohabitation like a genuine nida. Because again, this, as they were pointing out, this Mishnah is talking about a theoretical case, not talking about a practical case. And the Haredim points out, based on the Rosh in Nida 4.1, It's basically saying that the Haredim says that the practical halacha is that the bride must wait 4 days after the first act, and then starting from the fifth day, she counts 7 clean days and 7 days without any discharge of blood. And this in unlike the ordinary Nida, who starts counting her 7 clean days no earlier than the 6th day upon becoming forbidden to her husband. And following these 7 days, she immerses in the mikvah. Only then is she going to be permitted to the husband the second time. So in the case of the second act, basically the practical halacha is that you're going to wait 4 days, and then assuming there's no blood, then you count 7 days after that. But again, normally, it's going to be 7 and 7. So the Gemara is going to continue, and it was taught in a Beraisa that a bride is forbidden to her house. That's going to be forbidden to her husband for an entire 7-day period after the first cohabitation, and it is forbidden for her husband to take the cup of blessing from her. These are the words of Rabbi Eliezer. So the point here, what they're saying, the cup of blessing, this is really talking about the cup of wine for when you're talking about and saying the Berechot Mazon. And basically, he may not take from her an item that is not redeemed, that is not needed for a mitzvah. That's going to be the point. And this is one of the laws that also applies when a woman is going to be a nida. So Haredim points out that the Beraisa is teaching that a bride, after her first act of cohabitation, must keep all the laws that apply to an actual nida, and that is the halacha lemaisa on this stuff. Is that after that she has to apply the laws like she's a nida, but basically the time of counting is going to be a little bit different, assuming there's no other discharges of blood. So the Gemara is going to ask and say, what is Rabbi Eliezer's reason for this ruling? In other words, saying, why does he disagree with this Mishnah, which permits the bride to continue to cohabit with the groom? What's going on here? And I want to point out something from the B'dei Shulchan from Beurim 193.1, and it's saying that in Rabbi Eliezer's time, the rabbinical decree prohibiting the second act of cohabitation had not yet been promulgated. So that's going to be a key point here, that had not yet been a fence put up by the rabbis yet. The Gemara is going to answer. It says that Rabbi Eliezer maintains that it is impossible that uterine blood not come out together with the hymenal blood during the first act, and thus the woman must be regarded as an actual nida. In other words, the point that Rabbi Eliezer is making is going to be like this. Here's the point, right? And you can look in the Bavli Sota 20a for a parallel on this. Basically, when the woman, has relations the first time, there's going to be like this shock, and that's going to cause some blood to come from the uterus. Even though it's not a lot of blood, it could be some blood. And this uterine blood is going to mix with the blood from the hymen. And that can be, one way to look at it. Another way to look at it could be that there's a very strong emotional attraction toward her husband, and this could be what actually discharges the uterine blood. That is a sugya from Nida, and then that goes and mixes. And the Rambam in Hilchos Isure Bia, chapter 5, halacha 18, says, since a discharge of uterine blood renders a woman a Nida, whether it results from menstruation or not, it follows that this woman must be considered a Nida. So that's a key point. In other words, key point is that that there has to be a counting of 7 clean days, and that because it's basically that there's something that's happening where there's even if she doesn't menstruate, there's some small amount of blood that comes out. Have a great day.